now introduce the keynote speaker, Dr. Daphnee Hui Lin to deliver the first keynote presentation. And let me briefly introduce the speaker. She is an associate professor of Department of Education Policy and Leadership at the Education University of Hong Kong. Daphnee has a lifelong passion for understanding how change shapes professional identities and how professionals empower themselves in the face of change. Her research journey recently focuses on how teacher professionals collaborate to develop strategies to improve teaching and learning through professional learning communities. And today, the presentation topic is Redefining Distinction, Comparative Insights into International Schools' Identities and Relevance in Postcolonial Hong Kong and Singapore. Let's put our hands together for Daphnee.
Good morning, everyone. So I was listening to the opening speeches and really excited at how nicely they converge together. So the keynote topic that I've created for you today has got to do with some of the key issues that are confronting Hong Kong international schools today. Namely, how can we continue to attract international talent? And what is the future for Hong Kong with regard to this aspect? And consequently, its impact on international schools' identities and its role as the providers of international education. Right, so one of the things that whenever we discuss about Hong Kong, it's inevitable that the other narrative comes along, which is how does it compare to Singapore? So my friend Jan Gubei, he's over here. So we always talk about how Singapore and Hong Kong are like competitors. We're always competing, we're looking at each other for who is better and what we can learn from each other and what not to learn from each other as well. So these are some of the insights that I will be talking about in the keynote. Who is better? Now, that has always been a debate. So I was talking to Stuart before the start of the keynote. And, well, both of us were in Singapore at some moment. So I'm born Singaporean, I'm raised there. I worked as an assistant professor for 3 years before I came over here. And both Stuart and I chose to stay in Hong Kong, at least for now. So now, we were both agreeing Singapore is very nice. There's a lot of leverage because the state plans everything for you, and as long as you work within that space, there's a lot of room for development. In Hong Kong, the pace is rapid, it's fast. Singapore, garden city. So there's a lot of space for creativity, for thinking about ways out. Especially in today's keynote, I'm going to talk about the issue of identity. Now, I think we've always been focusing on who is better based on international benchmarks, ranking, results, perfect scores, and so on. So today, I'm going to take a look at some of the things that we may have developed from the post-colonial lens with regard to identity, how the foundations of international schools actually forged a lasting identity with regard to how we would provide international education to students. And with that, identities are enduring, but I hope to sort of stimulate some critical thinking with regard to, given the current circumstances today, the things that are changing rapidly, what we still have may be of a different circumstance, in the next few years, actually happening very rapidly. So with these stakes at play, who would be the one that has an advantage over the assessment benchmarks? I think that is a question that international schools have to ask yourselves, and I hope that we have some headways after the keynote. I think for Bourdieusian enthusiasts, you would be very familiar with this cartoon, or scholars who are interested in meritocracy. Now, for a long time, the benchmark has been this tree, right? And we have always known that the monkey has the advantage towards climbing the tree. And in a certain sense, when I look at this, well, the international schools would be the elite in this game, right, in terms of climbing the tree, in terms of scaling the benchmarks. And this has been a postcolonial phenomenon. And given the circumstances, when we talk about postcolonial, it's about changes in circumstances. For Singapore, it happened in 1965, in Hong Kong from 1997 onwards. There has been a lot of talk about independence from a British colonial legacy. So this has not passed despite decades passing, time passing with regard to what we need to do to move on. Till today, we are still confronted by this challenge. And what should be the identity for international schools in the way forward, rising above all the concerns about benchmarks and who should we assess, how should we assess, right, in terms of holistic education and so on. Now, to give a little bit of a background with regard to the decolonization process, I think it's kind of interesting because when I was looking at the policy changes, it seems like Singapore, for the international school market, it should be shrinking, but somehow it isn't. So that was what started me digging deeper. Before I continue, I would like to pose a disclaimer, right? I'm not an expert in international schools or international education, but I've done some homework, and from here, I try to develop an angle with regard to identities. So I hope my theoretical contribution to identities would be helpful in stimulating some thinking with regard to the future of international schools in terms of breaking certain boundaries and continue to attract international talent to Hong Kong. In Singapore, when it achieved its independence from the British, before that, the British left the colonial population to plan and organize their own education. And surprisingly, after independence, Singapore decided to promote an English medium of instruction and subsequently an English Mandarin bilingualism in the schools. So in Hong Kong, the British colonial government mandated English as the medium of instruction, but Hong Kong signals its independence from the British by introducing mother tongue education in Chinese. So given the broader context, taking an outsider's perspective of my research in Singapore and Hong Kong, what are some of the insights that we may develop with regard to international schools? Further, for Singapore government established an an English public education, and it has strict regulations with regard to local student enrollment in international schools. In contrast, for Hong Kong, the government maintains an open attitude towards local student enrollment into international schools, alongside a decline of English education in the mainstream public schools. So this, if we look at the transformations over time, it should have heralded that there should be a booming and thriving international school market versus in Singapore, where you have strict regulations in the international school segment. However, there is little known about how these identity changes over time are negotiated and its consequences on international schools' capacity or agency to provide international education. And at this turning point, I guess from 2019 onwards, there are certain things that we may have to think about with regard to international education and how Hong Kong can gain a leverage and continue to be on a strong trajectory in terms of their roles as international education providers. So before we move on, I would like to establish a definition with regard to international education. I believe some of the things that we talk about here from the OECD are familiar to you. As international education providers, there are certain things that we hope students can be learning in the schools, like perspective taking. For example, looking at everybody's side of the disagreement before making a decision. So with this keynote, I hope to stimulate some thoughts. So initially, maybe some of the things may not be of the typical or usual things that we may be expecting. But I hope that with a divergence of different ideas, we can come to a new synergy with regard to what is the future of international schools, right, in the Hong Kong context. And, well, I tried to imagine how I would feel if I were in their place. So a lot of it is perspective taking. I was looking at some of the statistics that I found and trying to think, how could I look at things differently? So this is one of the aspects which inspired the way I crafted today's keynote. Adaptability. So dealing with unusual situations, especially at times of stress and pressure. I think this is the time today when we are talking about having to adapt, at times of uncertainty, pressure, and not knowing how quickly things would have moved. So when I came to Hong Kong 7 years ago, people were telling me, oh, things are moving very fast towards a direction, towards some kind of uncertainty, some kind of a siege, right? And during then, I'm like, don't worry, by the time it happens, I would have retired, right? And today, I'm looking at things that are moving so quickly, I would never say such a thing ever again. It could be just a matter of months before some new situation has happened and becomes the status quo. So the next, intercultural communication. So when there are differences in perspectives, in terms of the cultural lens that we adopt, how do we still maintain a common platform of communication with others, right? And finally, attitude towards immigrants, towards new people. So this would be an important factor for attracting international mobility. So apart from most of the late motives when we talk about cultural diversity in Hong Kong, it focuses on marginalized minorities. But at the same time, it's also important to pay attention to attracting talent, which recently the chief executive has been talking about fighting for new talents to come into Hong Kong. So I would be examining some of the implications through this comparative study. And multilingual proficiency. So going on next, after this definition, I would like to examine the two contexts. Now, when I look at the two contexts and was trying to find an angle for comparative study to say, okay, can we look at one context and think about how Hong Kong should be moving? Should we be taking some ideas from the Singapore context, or should we do things differently? And what I found is, through a survey of the different international school programs in the two places, I found that they are structurally very similar in terms of having comprehensive programs for K-12 education and for more advanced programs. So the next thing I was examining is the international achievement results. And again, it's like watching a very highly competitive race. So both of them, try to outdo each other. And in some instances, for example, the average score for international baccalaureate. So Singapore does a little bit better than Hong Kong. So the indigo band is Hong Kong, and the orange one is Singapore. For global, so for them, the score is significantly higher than the band in blue, which is globally how the students are performing. But the next thing we look at is the scores 40 and above for Hong Kong and Singapore. This time around, Hong Kong does better, right? So in terms of the percentage of scores 40 and above, Hong Kong students does significantly better than Singapore. So there again, it's like, holding my breath, what's next? The next thing I saw was the perfect score, right? So for perfect score, Singapore in orange, Hong Kong in indigo again. Right, so for the perfect score, this time Singapore does better than Hong Kong. Singapore has 14% of its students achieving perfect score in the world, and Hong Kong 9%. So two tiny cities, taking up such a big share of the results versus the one in blue, 77% in the world had perfect scores. So I was thinking, okay, looking at all these scores, what do I say about anything? They are both very competitive, always looking at each other to say, I'm going to outdo you, right, in one or the other aspect. And then things started getting interesting when I look at the market share. So in terms of the market share, so both of them have a tiny segment, right? So in Hong Kong, 3%, and in Singapore, the market share is 8%. So that's kind of interesting. It's actually a little bit of a surprise to me, and it started making me think deeper about what's happening in terms of bilingual education. Actually, Hong Kong is in a stronger position in the international schools. Hong Kong international schools offer bilingual education in 15 of the schools. In Singapore, only 5 schools, okay? And when we are talking about bilingual education, in Hong Kong, it is truly bilingual education, which is a mixture of English and Mandarin as the medium of instruction in the schools. In Singapore, for the tiny segment of the 5 schools, it is usually strictly an English medium of instruction while giving Mandarin language courses. So, given these circumstances and the fact that in Hong Kong, there is an open and liberal attitude towards recruiting local students as the population, and in Singapore, there's a tight restriction of local student enrollment into the international schools. Why is it that the market share for Singapore international schools is significantly larger than that of Hong Kong's? So I was thinking, could we examine it in terms of identities? So they're both top performing, but how can we look at the identities of these schools to rethink how Hong Kong international schools can position yourselves in a way which is perhaps more competitive, not to compete in terms of results, but how can we improve our schools in itself? So I don't have a perfect answer, but what I would like to do is to give a little bit of my theoretical contribution, a theory of identity grafting that I've created in my previous studies. So in my book, Managing Chineseness, which is a study about Chinese Singaporean engineers who represent a French multinational corporation to deal with mainland Chinese clients and how they come to terms with their own Chinese identities. So international schools in the Hong Kong landscape is more or less like these corporate representatives. They represent a context which perhaps is not what they think is my mother identity, okay? And then they're dealing with clientele that are supposedly very close, supposedly where their ancestors come from, and yet they say that there's a lot of difference. So through all these different synergized interactions, how do they decide what is the best identity or position to take with regard to managing the relationships between so-called the Western culture, French society, French companies, and the mainland Chinese clientele, okay, the Chinese culture. So through that, I would like to think about what are some of the insights that can help with the sustainability of international schools to strengthen the agency and leverage of the international school advantage as the elite schools in Hong Kong. So identity grafting, as a basic definition, it refers to identity acquisition processes. So it could be an individual, a group, an organization, or even a nation thinking about the global context and deciding which position to take based on how they relate to a particular imagined community. So I'm saying imagined because we usually try to take a position based on who we think we belong to. For example, my grandmother, we are sort of like diasporic Chinese, who came actually a long time before the British arrived in Singapore. We went from Fujian to Southeast Asia and settled there. However, despite many of the state efforts to say, you're Singaporean Chinese, my grandmother would tell me, now, when you grow up and get married one day, you have to tell your mother-in-law who your ancestors are. Your ancestors are from China, Fujian, in a certain province called On Kai, right, in Cantonese. You must tell them you come from there because your ancestors are from China. So that's the imagined community that she establishes long time ago, where her ancestors came from, and that becomes her identity, which may be a little bit different from how I would identify myself. Okay, so I'm going to share the 4 constructs with regard to identity grafting later on. So based on this imagined community, it actually liberates you or constrains you, your agency, with regard to how you position yourself, how we can be able to reimagine the next strategic position to take with regard to what we would do in the school organization. So the 4 constructs are, for identity graphs, which I'm going to introduce: repressing, reversing, integrating, and blended. So yeah, we were talking about international education, and one of the examples is use more examples, okay, when you're communicating with an international audience. And I was thinking, I could be wrong, right? An English school, we would be quite familiar with whiskeys, right? And whiskeys are my personal favorite. And of course, I should be drinking lesser, but well, I'm going to use them as examples of the 4 constructs of identity grafting. The first one is repressing. Now, for me, I tend to drink single malt whiskeys, but the thing is, repressing may not be my favorite form of constructing my own identity, right? So if we were to apply international school identities to the construct, right, it would be an education program to align students with the dominant political, economic, or social standard. So students with personal experiences that are so-called misaligned, right, would have to be corrected. They have to be corrected because these are deficits that we need to change to displace and align with a particular standard. So given this form of education, right, the teaching would be, I think, in terms of previously, during Hong Kong's colonial days, when we're talking about correcting people's accents to de-orientalize an accent. Now, these would be typical or examples of a repressing education program. It seeks to sort of replicate as closely as possible the native English standard. And for students to learn English, they would not be able to, or they cannot communicate in any other language. For example, their Chinese home language, which could be polluting or believed to be polluting towards their learning of English. And the students would have to be assimilated, right? So they would be English speakers, but if they were to teach English, so that's what one of my students was confiding in me. She's an English teacher, but she would never be, because of her Chinese ethnicity, a native English teacher. Even though she was born in Canada, she spoke Canadian English her entire life, They would never call her a native English teacher. So in terms of learning, a student would have to display a standard English proficiency. And other non-standard languages should be used only at home. Okay, your mother tongue should only be used at home. So there is a clear distinction between the public and private sphere with regard to learning and teaching, okay, with the repressing graft. So this stands in opposition to the reversing graft. Now, if we were to look at whiskey again, to say that I don't want to be a whiskey would be to say, well, then I should start to create gin, So a lot of times when we look at the global hegemonic power balance, the political aspects, when we talk about, we redefine international education is to make it not international education at all, right? So that's the reversing graft, which is to say, okay, we're going to create something as powerful. If the single malt whiskey is 24 years, then it should be 24 years, but the attribute should be that it should be anything else but gin. So a lot of times when we listen to the late motives about failing to decolonize and so on, it takes on this angle, right? And for a reversing graft, the angle is that an international education program should be to, it's sort of like, I think, okay, it's sort of like we start to question the sustainability of international education, whether it should continue, whether it should be still regarded as the elite. And a lot of times, the programs that seek to restore a lost identity refers to this leitmotif. It's about reversing the transformations that has happened, for example, in Hong Kong. And it's about expressing a refusal to comply, about doing the opposite, or disengaging. And I think a lot of times these narratives makes us question if international education or international schools are sustainable in Hong Kong. And the consequences of taking on this leitmotif, if we look at the broader education context, would be the narrative about mother tongue education that's happening in the mainstream schools. To have students educated in the Chinese medium of instruction so that they would be able to, the assumption is they would be able to learn better, right? So some of the policies that were happening during decolonization would be to displace English as the medium of instruction. Of course, there are still EMI, or English Medium of Instruction, education in the public schools in Hong Kong, in the mainstream. However, we would know if we are observing the lessons. The student teachers will be telling you, in reality, we hardly speak English in the classrooms. So given these things that are happening, right, I think for the reversing graft, it is something which makes us think, now, how would we respond to a reversing graft in this broader context? What do we do? So many of the literature that I examined, they cited, even for learning Mandarin as Chinese language, there would be a lot of reasons given that, because of the lack of the context in the learning environment, we are unable to teach, for example, Mandarin as Chinese language in these schools. So these are two possible ways of constructing identities when we think about reform, about transforming the way we look at education. Then we look at the next two, which is integrating. So I will go to integrating first. An integrating education program encourages mixing. So it would be like this Canadian whiskey that we have here, right? It talks about, okay, I'm going to read it here because it came from the website when I'm scouting for whiskeys to talk about. So instead of a single distiller, right, which is the Teeling 24 years. They talk about single distiller from a single distillery, from a single cask, and so on, right? We move on to the gin, right? When I look at the website, how they sell the gin, they will say, this is an assertive gin, right? It's my dad's gin. It's a textbook gin. Both of them talk about purity, authenticity, about a single way of doing things, right? For this one, it's mixed, and they encourage mixing. Infused with Madagascar vanilla, this bottle of Crown Royal will certainly please a sweet tooth. Try it with a Canadian coffee, an Irish coffee with maple syrup, or mixed with iced cold cola. So instead of encouraging you to mix whiskey with something else, and an education program that is inspired by the integrated identity would connect to different international political, economic, and social identities. So it sort of tries to address some of the ambivalences, right, sorry, time's up, I have to speed up, of some of the post-colonial sentiments that people have in the reversing graft, right? So let me go on to blending. Now, blending sort of tries to develop some kind of a synergy with regard to the international identity. It synergizes diverse pedagogical experiences together and develops a new identity from there. So, well, I'm going to read this last part because it's important from the website Selling the Whiskey. 20 malt masters were invited to the distillery and to pick any expression from the thousands of casks maturing in the warehouse. The 20 chosen whiskies were then married by malt master Brian Kinsman to create this single malt you see before your eyes. The magic part is marrying. Now, when you integrate, how many things can you mix together before they start feeling a little bit strange? So we may have different diversities. The global landscape is expanding, but how do we then create a single identity without making people lose the essence of who they really are? So I would like to look at the two landscapes again. Now, if we look at bilingual education in Hong Kong, right, English and Mandarin are actually not the home languages of the local majority here. So almost 90% of the students actually speak in Cantonese. So given this reality, the risk of disengagement or the smaller market share may be because there's a lack of resonance with the larger population. Ooh, sorry. So it could be the reason creating all these different reversing and repressing graphs. The relationship becomes one of repression and reversion, right? And we look at the broader education context, we can understand why the identities are constructed in this way. The Education Bureau commands that there should be at least 70% of the population which is maintained as a international grouping of different nationalities. However, in reality, parents and schools are reversing this trend. By reverse, it's actually 70 or more % of local students being enrolled in international schools. Given the declining English proficiency in the mainstream schools, the parents are trying to reverse it to obtain an English education. Now, with this interrelationship, it is actually constraining because the international schools and the mainstream schools develop a competitive position against each other. Versus in Singapore, the home language and the international school languages and mainstream school languages are more in line. So the majority of them speak English and Mandarin as their home languages. And this creates a nice synergy between the identities of the mainstream schools, which are English, adopting English medium of instruction, same as the international schools, and same as the home languages of the students. And for the Ministry of Education of Singapore, when we look at the broader context, we realize that they are actually quite synergized with what is aspired in the mainstream landscape. There is a consistent policy with regard to international schools of promoting diversity. So each school cannot, the enrollment cap of each nationality is 30%, right? So the consequences are when we look at the average number of nationalities for international schools, in Hong Kong, it's 27 nationalities. In Singapore, 46 nationalities on the average for each international school. Now, when we look at these, we realize that taking an integrated and blended identity graph would actually be more sustainable for the international school identity than would taking a repressing and reversing position, right? It starts from the policy context, how international schools are regulated, how mainstream schools are regulated, and as a result, how parents would be attracted. When we look at the broader global context, it also influences international mobility. What is attractive to international people? Which context would they choose? And of course, now, as we look at Hong Kong, it's also starting to trickle to the local population. Which place would they choose to educate their children, right? And given that, I'm sorry for the rush, all right? So given that, I think when we look at the international school, I don't have an answer which identity would be the best for your school. I think you are the experts with regard to this area, and you would decide. But there are some things that we perhaps can consider. Would we take a repressing approach, which is to say that the international school should then repress the other aspects that fail to resonate with the main local communities within the Hong Kong context? Or should we take a reversing approach, which is to then maybe start teaching the monkey how to swim to fit in with the post-colonial context? Or would we try to integrate different aspects of learning, which is what holistic education is about, learning about different skills? However, if poorly implemented, we have to then consider about private tutoring agencies trying to benefit from it, because there are so many different skills to learn, and exam pressure, okay, because such things may be then examination topics. Or finally, do we think about blending, creating a new identity that synergizes different aspects? So the different identities are still able to produce top academic results, but then we may have to think about the consequences of education, about what we would like our students to be taught, and where would the international mobility be heading, and thus the future of international schools as international education providers. So with that, thank you, and here is my QR code, okay. My QR code if you would like to download some of my articles for free from the ResearchGate account, and my email. Thank you.